This is Endgame, and I'm Amanda Cassett. In this episode, I speak with John Lilic, investor and early Ethereum adopter, and Stefano Gogioso, quantum computing lecturer at Oxford and co-founder of Never Local. We unpack how quantum computers could soon crack the encryption securing Bitcoin and the entire crypto ecosystem, and debate how close Q-Day really is and what crypto needs to do about it right now. All right, let's jump right in. What is quantum cryptography, and why could it be a major threat to crypto?
So quantum cryptography actually refers to two different things. One of them is the ability from quantum computers to break existing cryptography. Most of the existing cryptography is based on asymmetric cryptography primitives, such as RSA or elliptic curve cryptography, and that is weak to attacks by quantum computers, attacks that cannot be performed by classical computers. But there's also a second meaning for quantum cryptography, which is cryptography that can be done with quantum devices, which is a different thing. So there's a negative thing. There's an attack element to it. The current cryptography is broken, but there's also a positive thing. There's new things we can do with cryptographic primitives that are purely quantum and cannot be done classically.
So paint me a picture. In a world with fully developed quantum computing, what's the worst case scenario thing that could happen to crypto?
Where quantum computers come today, so if we have, let's say, some major player that has been doing this for a while, that has capabilities that we don't know about, undisclosed, and they reach the point where they can break the keys, well, they can sign any transaction, really. Most of our cryptography is broken from one day to the next. It probably means that most of the crypto value goes to zero until it gets patched. But it might never get the opportunity to be patched. It's pretty bad. But even in a world where this doesn't happen today, as in, let's say it happens in 5 years or 10 years, we already have a problem, because maybe transactions are not going to be vulnerable, but certainly there's a lot of secrets that are kept using elliptic curve cryptography. Zero knowledge, the initial versions of zero knowledge, the first versions were based on weak cryptography that will be broken one day by quantum computers. This data stored on blockchains, it will be there for the next 5 years. It's stored now, the later issue. So we already have a problem today. If we know that these machines are coming, and some of these secrets have more than a 5-year lifespan, like, I don't know, you did something bad and you did it under the cover of sort of early days zero knowledge technology, then that's already an issue.
Yeah, I would also add to that from a, let's say, market standpoint, it may not even be the case that we have to enter into the quantum computing age before we start to see a bit of chaos. And this is something I've kind of written about and talked about. You look at stablecoins as an example. We're obviously hundreds of billions at this point, trending to potentially trillions. And what we're seeing now in that space is very smart institutional capital deploying on a very large scale. And so you can imagine a scenario where any one of these wonderful, incredible quantum computing startups, I use PsiQuantum often as an example. I'm not saying they will do this, but let's say they demonstrate a much smaller elliptic curve demonstration break, essentially. So like a 32-bit elliptic curve break to kind of highlight their capabilities. At that point, or some other key milestone like that, where the market begins to realize that we're at a stage now where it's just a matter of scaling up. And so at that point, you can kind of take a look at this stuff and say, well, what needs to happen for all of my stable coins, all of my capital that I've deployed onto stable coins, for those networks to upgrade effectively in order to protect all of that money. And that's when you start to unfurl all of the problems that come with essentially trying to upgrade blockchains to post-quantum cryptography, because even in the most optimistic cases, there's still naive users who could compromise other users and so on. And so that's where I personally think we're going to start to see the first kind of stampede, because while banks can simply upgrade their certificates, in that scenario, there's a really strong argument that you'd be better off just holding your dollars in a bank account than you would potentially, in some unknown attack vector scenario on chain. And then that could be the first kind of wave of basically chaos that we might begin to see that could threaten the integrity of blockchain networks in terms of not only testing the redemption capabilities of many of these issuers, but also you look at price discovery. A lot of Bitcoin price discovery, for example, is against USDT pairs and so on. So I would say even before this stuff is realized, just the market coming to terms with the fact that it's coming very soon could already start to cause some problems for us.
So let me back up for a second and just talk about what this breakthrough is, what quantum is. The idea, and please tell me which parts of this I get wrong, is that we have supercomputers today. They are only so powerful. All of the encryption standards, whether it's for crypto networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum, whether it's the encryption that you're used to on WhatsApp, the encryption you're used to on Signal, HTTPS, those standards have all been built for security from the kinds of computers that we have today. And they've been effective to that degree. But once we get quantum computers, it'll be trivial to break that encryption because they're so much more powerful, to the point where we need to upgrade all of the things that we want to stay encrypted ahead of this transition in order to be ready, or else have all of our data and information exposed in the case of something like Signal or WhatsApp, or in the case of something like crypto, to be able to actually break the encryption on your public and private key so that someone could take all of the value that you think you have on your ledger or in your MetaMask wallet. Is that basically the picture of what's happening? Flesh that out for me.
Yeah, that is correct. That is the overall picture of what we're facing right now. I can also make a bit of a distinction between two kinds of classical cryptography that we use. One of them is symmetric encryption, and the other one is asymmetric encryption. So symmetric encryption is where you establish a key pair that has where both parties sort of share the same key, let's say in the simplest scenario. Asymmetric key cryptography, or public key cryptography as it's known, is the one that's used for encryption and authentication with parties that you don't have a pre-shared secret, where you don't have a pre-shared secret. That's the one that's used to sign all of the transactions on blockchains. It's the one that's used to authenticate on the websites. And it's the one that's used to start the symmetric encryption sessions. So typically you use a certificate to authenticate your connection to a website, let's say, and then the first step is a handshake where you generate a secret key that is shared between the website and you, and then the rest of the communication is sort of encrypted with this encryption that you both have. The problem is that the initial step is weak. So the asymmetric side of the thing, the public key cryptography, is the one that's broken by quantum computers more easily, and that is fully broken. The picture is when you add one bit of security today, you double roughly the amount of computational power that's needed by a classical supercomputer to break it. So I need to make a supercomputer that is twice as powerful in order to break a key with that one additional bit. With a quantum computer, you have to add one more qubit. Well, 3 more qubits, sure, but it's linear. And so it's much, much easier. Once you have 1,000 qubits, having 1,003 qubits is not that hard. And so the problem we face is that right now it feels a bit far, because we say, okay, we have 100 qubits, physical qubits, which make maybe one goodish logical qubit today. But you have to look at the timeline that these companies have. You have to ask, are all of these little pieces of information we get from them on the projected timeline? If they are, then you have to just look at where the timeline meets the necessary number of qubits. And that's in the early 2030s for some of the actually more conservative estimates. If we believe that some players are progressing faster, that may be in the even 2030 or slightly earlier. So it's one of those things that feels far because it's an exponential process, and we are bad at judging exponential processes. But it's actually not that far. If you look at the line and all the dots fall onto the line, just follow the line. So yes, that's roughly what we're facing today.
To Stefano's point, as far as it feeling far, last year I started to go deep into this stuff around the summertime, and I had a bit of existential angst for about a month. I couldn't sleep because to his point, I realized that actually it's one of those things where it seems far and then suddenly it's everything. It's just kind of like how AI, when we had ChatGPT, suddenly it was everything and it just seemed to come out of nowhere almost. The thing is, when you look at the ecosystem right now, you've got multitude of different approaches for cracking these hard problems, okay, by some of the smartest, most incredible startups in the world that are tremendously well funded. Really, I mean, it's a phenomenal ecosystem. And so many of these approaches involve much smaller devices that don't necessarily have to be this one gigantic machine that only the NSA or something, the US military can build. And networking these smaller devices together potentially is one path that seems to be very promising. And so once you kind of understand that part, then you can start to make sense of things like Google Willow, which shows error correction at scale, which would be one of the necessary components to achieve such a goal. And really, when you delve even further into it, you see that a lot of these credible companies, I keep talking about PsiQuantum, they're already in the kind of like manufacturing phase, essentially. They're building new plants as well. You have government leaders from around the world who are basically shilling them. This stuff is happening at a tremendous pace, and sometimes, to Stefano's point, it's hard for us to see that, but there's a few more kind of steps. And likewise, when you look at the original time roadmaps, for example, DARPA, IBM, et cetera, Riverlane, and others, we're actually right on schedule, if not ahead of schedule in many cases. So it's moving quickly.
So I want to back up for a moment and talk about, there's obviously this big change happening in terms of what computers can do, that we are currently, if you guys are to be believed, that we're currently on the verge of in the early 2030s. What is this change? How does this work? Like, what's the thing, if you can explain it to some degree in layman's terms, what's the thing that's being unlocked that's making it possible to solve problems in minutes that used to take billions of years? What's happening?
In a sense, there's this has always existed. As in, this is just the way that nature works at the most fundamental level. Nature is quantum mechanical. The processes that happen between atoms, between photons, between particles do this by themselves. You don't really have to do much to them. You just have to harness them a little. The problem is that getting to the technological point where we can control them with little noise and with high fidelity, so we can make them do what we want, is hard. And it requires a certain amount of miniaturization. It requires a certain amount of evolution of various technologies. And right now we are in a place where we don't yet know which technology will allow us to do this best. So we're in a sort of exploratory phase where we are advanced enough that we can do interesting things more than just tiny like lab experiments, but we're not yet to the point where we know that this one is the one that we want to use. What has changed is really just a sudden influx of capital and interest into things that have been developed over the past 2 decades. And that has accelerated everything. Once you see Rigetti doing superconducting chips, then you get IBM and Google saying, oh, we have the same stack. Why don't we also put money in this and perfect the same kind of technologies? You have labs that have been working on ion traps for ages. You see IonQ trying to bring that to the market. And then you get people like Honeywell Quantum saying, why don't we partner with Cambridge Quantum Computing and make a giant that can attract lots of funding to just push this as fast as we can. And we get into a race. It's a race now. You have photonics, you have neutral atoms, you have ion traps, you have superconducting, you have like maybe 6, 8 different base technologies that people are developing to get this done. The difference with classical computers is really just the behavior of these machines. They have more, if you will, more degrees of freedom. They can move in more ways than classical hardware can, because classical hardware was designed to be very stable. It is like we have trillions of bits, right, available on our machines at home. And they have to encode information for really long times, and they have to process it with lots of accuracy. You cannot afford a bit flip in a computation. It's unprecedented. But here we're talking about the situation where you sort of let go of that security and try to just harness the lowest possible level of physics. And because you don't need that stability, or you get it in other ways, you get access to more ways of transforming things. And those ways unlock completely different kinds of computation. They're not necessarily strictly more powerful than classical computers, as in quantum computers will not do everything faster than classical computers. But there are things that you can do with them that in a classical way would take, as you said, billions of years, and for a quantum computer would take a few seconds or a few minutes.
What are the use cases here that are causing this arms race to build quantum computers? Because I figure that these projects aren't trying to crack the Bitcoin encryption. That's a small problem for them.
Yeah, it's a big problem for everybody else, but yes, for them, I don't think that's the benchmark. They use it. It's a famous problem, and it's interesting because everybody gets really worried about it. But if you go to quantum technology conferences, or if you look at the funding rounds and what these companies promise and develop, really they look at quantum chemistry, fundamental physics, so things to do with new materials, simulations of new materials. Why? Well, they are made of quantum stuff. They behave in a quantum way. And so the easiest way to simulate them is to have something which is a programmable quantum system, where you say, okay, I just take my computer and I make it behave like this big molecule, which would be really hard to simulate classically. But a quantum computer does the same operations, and so it's easy to simulate it with a quantum computer. But then you also have algorithms that exploit this for other things, like fluid simulations. Very hard to do, famously hard to do, and be accelerated with quantum. And people have developed a lot of different proposals for quantum algorithms over the years that go well beyond factoring or cracking keys. And so different companies emphasize different aspects. There's a point where optimization was a big thing. Like lots of quantum companies said, we want to do quantum optimization. That's the D-Wave spiel, if you would.
What does that
D-Wave.
mean in tangible terms? Quantum optimization, what does that get you?
Say that you want to optimize the supply chain for a very large business, or you want to optimize the design of a large aircraft. You have you formulate this as a problem. You say, here are my constraints, here are my costs, and here is the variables that I can touch. Please find me a solution that fits all of my constraints or violates them the minimum and makes the cost the lowest possible. Not necessarily the lowest that could be possible, but as low as you can make it. And that's a hard problem. It's known to be hard in general. And quantum computers with certain algorithms provide solutions that are believed to be significantly better than classical solutions. And so people developed algorithms, refined them, spent a lot of time doing this. D-Wave, I think, still has this as their core business model, even though technically the computers that D-Wave builds are not universal quantum computers. They're quantum machines of a sort, but they're not the same as the ones that Google or Quantinuum build.
Yeah, I mean, just one quick point I wanted to make to add to what Stefano said. The future is very exciting. You can consider all these incredible use cases, I don't know, simulating nuclear fusion, and that leading to endless, clean, abundant power that gives us, a type 2 or a type 1 civilization. And so the incentive to reach these incredible potential unlocks with this technology are very, very strong, which is the thing that's driving tremendous amounts of investment into this space. And as it turns out, elliptic curve cryptography is like the lowest hanging fruit. It's a byproduct. So breaking elliptic curve cryptography is a byproduct of basically these, achieving these use cases. And it's the first thing to go. It's kind of like we're in the crosshairs here. And it's a force that basically we can't stop. And so the only thing we can do is adjust accordingly. And that's kind of another point that I think sometimes gets lost. Not trying to be alarmist or panic anyone, but just be realistic about like the full scope and scale of the force that we're facing here, which is ultimately a tremendous good for humanity, but along the way is going to certainly take out elliptic curve cryptography.
Elliptic curve cryptography is the cryptographic basis of it's how blockchains are encrypted, specifically ECDSA, and that stands to be broken as one of the first things to be broken by quantum computation. If I've got that right, and in this context, do you think that major blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum are preparing adequately for what's about to happen?
That is a hard question. As far as they say in public, no. The situation is very different between Bitcoin and Ethereum because of the way their governance works, right? Ethereum, it has a more centralized sort of foundation that directs development. Bitcoin is slightly more decentralized in its development. So you have to look at what the major players say. That is their positioning that tells you what they want to do. Now, whether that's what they are doing internally is a bit harder to determine, but at least what they say in public and what they do in public is not enough right now. Bitcoin, a lot of the more prominent Bitcoin players don't really believe that this is a threat. Not yet. And the Ethereum Foundation has people inside that have been working on possible solutions, but they do acknowledge that it is very complicated to replace some of the more advanced cryptographic primitives that they use, because it's not just elliptic curve cryptography, it's a lot of derivatives of elliptic curve cryptography that they use internally. Some of those are easier to replace because they're common to other infrastructure stacks, and so people have worked on post-quantum versions. But a lot of these primitives are kind of custom, because the Ethereum Foundation sponsored a lot of novel cryptographic work over the years, and that's harder. Nobody else is going to work on it. It has to be for them to do, or for someone to do it for them. But it's not something that a bank would do, because they don't use that kind of primitive. So right now, the answer in short is not really. No, they don't seem to be taking this quite as seriously as people who look at quantum timelines would want. But John has a lot more detailed opinions.
The other problem is, I'll be frank about it. I mean, this is all interconnected. So I wrote an article about how Bitcoin is at risk due to stablecoins, and you look at, kind of what I mentioned earlier as far as an exodus of stablecoin issuers into post-quantum bank accounts, which would be much safer potentially. There is well over $100 billion on the Tron network, for example, of stablecoins. And so if you're a Bitcoiner, it's like, what are the odds that Tron is going to implement all of this stuff successfully and in time? What about other blockchains? They're all interconnected. You look at the L2 ecosystem, for example, Polygon, my alma mater. I love Polygon very much, but effectively it's a multisig, right? The POS is a multisig that relies on elliptic curve cryptography. You look at all of the L2 ecosystems. Right now in Ethereum, we're talking about L2s as sort of parasitic and, kind of causing to detriment value accrual, to ETH and the L1. But the thing is, they're all reliant on elliptic curve cryptography and somehow anchored on Ethereum for their security. All of that becomes completely vulnerable. You look at Solana, for example. Again, I have a lot of respect for those guys. I haven't seen any real tremendous sort of push in this direction. Bitcoin just had its first BIT proposal on post-quantum cryptography submitted, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, basically. You look at a guy like
360, right?
Correct. And you look at a guy like Jameson Lopp, who I admire. He's out there kind of talking about these things, but he has to be very careful. And frankly, he's received quite a bit of hate from Bitcoin maximalists. I've had my fair share of battles with Bitcoin maximalists over the years who outright just call him a grifter and say this is all a scam. It's like, fundamentalism that doesn't even want to accept the potential for this to be a risk. And then you look at the exchanges, okay, and all of the service providers that are like highly intertwined with this ecosystem. They become sort of another key cog in like upgrading all of this effectively. You sort of look at Ethereum building an L2 ecosystem, and it's taken many, many years, and we still have tremendous inefficiencies. This is going to be a much more like complicated, I think, and much more technically challenging problem to solve. And even still, if we solve it, there's many cases where naive users could interact with certain smart contracts, thereby exposing addresses of others and so on. So you kind of unfurl, and there's layers and layers and layers of problems that present other problems and so on. And this is going to take many years of like dispute and differing opinions and viewpoints, etc. Again, it's not like banks just simply upgrading their or financial institutions upgrading their to post-quantum cryptography. This is going to be a much more contentious path, and frankly, I personally have a lot of concerns that we're not taking it seriously enough ahead of time.
So let me try to steelman the other side. Adam Back, who's a cryptographer, Bitcoiner, CEO of Blockstream, has said that he thinks post-quantum risk is decades out, and that there will be plenty of time to develop and implement quantum-resistant signatures. We have folks like Paolo, the CEO of Tether, which makes USDT, which you just talked about, stablecoins on top of Ethereum and Tron, other networks. He's also suggested that this is really far out. It's not something that's going to happen in the near future, and there's plenty of time to upgrade. And then I read about this a little bit, and it seems like if a Bitcoin address has never actually spent Bitcoin, has never actually used to send Bitcoin out, that it would be safe. So maybe in theory, Bitcoin holders can just transfer their Bitcoin to a new wallet. Give me the evidence for the other perspective. Why are these guys all wrong? And why would these simpler, calmer approaches not make sense?
Let me start by saying this, and these are people who have significant stakes in Bitcoin and USDT. I am confident in this enough that I would be happy to get a bunch of large investors together and make a huge bet against these people, and I'll happily take their money. If they think that this is 30 years away, I mean, I would bet against that. I will bet
Let's
pretty
get
heavily
a
against it.
falling market. Let's get a prediction
We
market
have
going.
Yeah, maybe with some additional stake, I think that would be a good idea. Yes. The reason to believe that this is going on schedule is that we have a schedule that these companies have put up a few years ago and constantly update every year. It has a predicted progression of their technology, and you look at the data points they use to test their technology regularly. They make publicly peer-reviewed papers. They make announcements. Some of these, of course, are hugely inflated, but you have to not. You don't have to read the press releases. You have to read the numbers. You have to read the fidelity of the error correction. You have to read the number of logical qubits. Like the technical details tell you the story, and you plot these numbers against the curves, and they follow the predicted trend. So at least for now, the evidence seems to be that these people are exactly on track. They are doing what they said they would do a few years ago, and they continue to fit the same exact curve. They have incentives to do it, of course. If you follow that progression to the predicted end, that tells you that within less than a decade, they will be able to break these keys. There is not much to do there. So if the point is quantum computers are not going to be powerful enough within the next decade, I would bet heavily against that. If the point is that there are ways to solve this, of course, but ultimately they are only partial solutions. Because you can move things to a new address temporarily, that's a patch. But then what are you going to do? Not spend your coins? The moment you make transactions based on elliptic cryptography, you are again vulnerable. The part is anything that was protected by ECC is broken. So if your encryption didn't really rely on it and you had some other way of protecting your secrets, great. But whatever that was useful for is not going to be useful for anymore. And so you have to acknowledge that. So thinking that this is not coming, I think is a bit of a misunderstanding of the state of technology today. And I know it's hard to follow developments in quantum computing. It's a very different field. And there's a lot of claims and counterclaims. We can talk about the Microsoft announcement, for example, later on. But the reality is technical. You look at the progression, you look at the timelines, we are on track. And we know where the track ends.
Yeah, I would say for all of us who were in Ethereum in the beginning, in those very early days, Adam Beck was very wrong about this future success of Ethereum. I mean, his predictions basically didn't pan out exactly, even though he had very high conviction that Ethereum would fail and not gain any traction. And with respect to Bitcoin, a couple points I would make. First of all, I think the real vulnerability is the moment the market starts to lose confidence in elliptic curve cryptography and or has any doubt, the price of everything will change, okay, and potentially to a significant detriment if the belief is that these networks have not taken enough action to basically ensure trust. Okay, that's the first point. Second point, with respect to Bitcoin, as Stefano said, what are you going to do? Not spend it? Just keep it there? And then you look at, for example, the Lightning Network, which right now is growing tremendously. The Lightning Network exposes every single address in the system, right? And so if the Lightning Network continues to grow, and we're talking about, let's say, a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 year trajectory before this stuff, materializes, as far as the quantum computing side, there's going to be huge numbers of Bitcoin addresses exposed. And even still, you look at, Jameson Lopp put out an article about confiscating basically Satoshi and other early Bitcoin that's exposed when it becomes vulnerable to quantum risk. I wrote a counter article about like 100-year hourglass theory, essentially reintroducing that Bitcoin slowly. But in any case, you can already see it's contentious. Like, what are you going to do with the 30% that's vulnerable, right? Are you going to confiscate it? How does that change the trust in Bitcoin? Does that break the social contract? Does that create a DAO moment for Bitcoin and so on and so forth? How does that impact the price? So, there are other factors as well, but I think the perception of confidence is probably the first, the first true test we're going to have. And we have to be prepared, because once the market starts to price this in, we need to be able to show that we're well on our way in order to keep that confidence.
I guess my next question for you is, I'd love to ask you why the market today isn't currently pricing this in, because your implication is that the most vocal leaders who say that this isn't something imminent to worry about, or that it's really far out, that they're motivated by trying to keep prices up, and they're motivated to conceal reality. And luckily, we don't even need Polymarket for this. We already have a prediction market in terms of crypto prices, in terms of stock price, for people to act when they feel like they're being misled by interested parties and when they think something big is about to happen. Why is this not currently a concern to the big institutions coming into the space? Are they looking at the wrong things? Are they misled by interested parties? And if we want to strip away all interest from this and just get down to the technicals and understand exactly what's really happening, where should a layman go to understand how quickly Q day is coming?
Just from a market standpoint, I just want to be clear. So I think there's two sides to that coin. And Amanda, as you rightly point out, it seems like the crypto market is not pricing this in. Although prices have been going down recently. I don't know if it's related to that or not. I mean, I guess it's hard to say, right, in terms of why prices are moving in a certain direction. But from, let's say, the quantum computing or quantum ecosystem standpoint, valuations are skyrocketing. So, it is definitely the case, whether it's PsiQuantum, who's currently raising $750 million at like $6 billion, $7 billion valuation, which is going to be oversubscribed if it's not already. I think it's called ID Quantique, a Swiss cryptography firm that was acquired or is in the process of being acquired by IonQ for $250 million. These are valuations right now across the board that are just absolutely skyrocketing. I think over the next year or two, you're going to continue to see M&As with startups basically being gobbled up, and prices commensurate to that continuing to rise. Whether that has an impact on crypto prices or not, we'll see. But I think at some point, it's going to be undeniable to the entire market that, in fact, the valuations of these quantum computing companies are absolutely skyrocketing, and it must be for a reason. Martin Shkreli says it's all a big scam, so maybe he's right. I don't know, but I tend to believe that's not the case. And the reason the valuations are going up is because smart, informed people who have access to privileged information, like very large sovereign wealth funds, are realizing the implications of this stuff, and that's why the valuations are pumping. If that's true, then it might be the case that at some point the crypto markets start to interpret the growth in those valuations as potentially some risk metric as far as like, the likelihood of ECC being broken, and maybe that might impact prices. I don't know, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So if I was steel manning Shkreli right now, no, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I guess someone could say that just like the folks saying it's not worrisome are interested parties, that you working in this field, starting companies, investing in companies in this space are also interested parties. And it is beneficial to you to fearmonger. So I guess where can you point us to a good source of objective information about when Q day is happening, how fast progress is happening, so that we can not worry that we're getting information that's biased from one side or the other?
Yeah, I mean, that is an absolutely fair point, in the sense that it's normal for people who believe something to take an interested position. And at the same time, it's normal for people with an interest to go and say, this is what we believe, and obviously this will benefit us. That's fine. You just go and look at the press releases from these companies. They have public roadmaps, all of them. IBM, Google, they're not in crypto. They don't have any interest in spreading any fear in the crypto markets. That is not their business. Their business is to make quantum computers these days. Well, Google does more things, but Quantinuum has a roadmap. IonQ has a roadmap. PsiQuantum has a roadmap. Xanadu has a roadmap. Each of them, they have individual roadmaps. They say what their intended progression is. They tell you when they expect to have 1 logical qubit, 10 logical qubits, 100 logical qubits, 1,000 logical qubits. Okay? They tell you. And then they publish dots on these roadmaps regularly when they make big releases for new experiments that say, we are here. And as long as the dots are kind of on the line, and they continue to be on the line for a while, and these companies are well funded, the presumption is probably that unless you have other information, that's what's going to continue happening. And so I think regardless of interested parties, not interested parties, the technology is clear. The limits are clear. We know, and we have an upper bound on the number of logical qubits necessary to break the keys. There's lots of literature on this. There's a Litinsky paper by PsyQuantum that makes this very clear, proposes a clear architecture with lots of numbers that people would be able to understand, because it's ultimately just saying this is how much it takes, this is how long it takes to break a key if we have this machine, this machine, this machine. That's public information. That is from an uninterested party because it's quantum computing manufacturers. You go to the other manufacturers and look at their recent roadmaps and say, are they on track? Where does the line reach the critical point? That's it. You don't have to trust me. I mean, I'm just effectively repeating what's in the public domain. There's Unitary Fund maintains various metrics for this. It's a non-profit organization that keeps a lot of benchmarking information about quantum releases. You can go see there. That's with Zhang. That's the team. They don't have a crypto interest. Again, they have no direct revenue from saying either one thing or the other thing. They just track quantum computing development. So I'd say go look at not necessarily the top line of the press release that says that we live in parallel universes. Just look at the one below. Just look at the one that says how many logical qubits do we have and how many logical qubits we expect to have in 6 months. That's the part that you care about.
And so what is the number of logical qubits at which you can break Bitcoin's cryptography? What's the level that we should be worried about? When's it happening and who's going to do it, right? Like we hear this announcement from Microsoft. We heard about Google Willow. Give us the contours here.
You need about 3 times as many logical qubits as bits of cryptography. So a few thousand, low thousand logical qubits. But you don't need all of them in the same machine is the new thing. It used to be the case that people thought, I have to develop a very large quantum computer. And the reality is you don't really have to do that. You can develop smaller machines and then you connect them with quantum infrastructure, with quantum networks. And as long as you do this right and your interface between the fiber optics and the machine is good, which is itself technically challenging, but something that people work on and have been working on for a while, then you can make smaller machines that have a few hundred logical qubits and you connect a few dozen or a few hundred of them, and you have all the necessary logical qubits to run the algorithm. This is an innovation that really changed things because you don't have to have them on one machine. You just have to have many small machines that you can connect. And this is kind of what PsyQuantum is proposing. And it's what their architecture would be good at doing because it's already photonic. And so this interconnection is very natural for them. It's not zero cost, but it's very low cost in a sense. The important thing to know is that the metrics today are given in terms of physical qubits. And so Google has a few hundred physical qubits. Quantinuum has a few dozen physical qubits. To make a logical qubit, you have to have many physical qubits, and the number depends on your architecture, depends on how good it is, how fine-tuned it is. It can go from a low dozen to 1, to a few hundreds to 1, to thousands to 1 if you have a very poor architecture. But at some point, that the ratio will start growing and the number of logical qubits will start growing. Right now, Google demonstrated 1. Okay, and that seems small because you're like, how long is it gonna take to go from 1 to 2? And the answer is they know, because it's not really about 1 logical qubit. It's 100 physical qubits that have been made good enough to make kind of 1 logical qubit. Good. In a year, they will have 2, 3, 5, 10. And then in 2 years, they'll have 100. And then they'll start connecting these machines. It's not hard to see that at the pace we're going in 5, 10 years, this would be doable. There is a lot of cryptography that can be done with quantum computers, not even quantum computers, just quantum devices. So not as capital intensive as what Google is building, let's say, much smaller, near-term devices that could be manufactured with existing fabrication technology and can be deployed within a few years, 2, 3 years. That can't be done classically. So you can use quantum information to do cryptography that is new and unique. It's not something that you can do better. It's something that you just couldn't do before. It's uniquely quantum. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we are currently working on. One of them is with quantum cryptography, you have a much stricter attack model than you can have with classical cryptography. So say that you have some high security application, or you have like a high stakes application where there is an interest from potentially even the people who supply you with the cryptographic devices to eavesdrop or tamper with what you're doing. This is what we've seen for the most recent hacks. They're not really hacks on necessarily the cryptography, they're hacks on the layer below. They're hacks on the interfaces, they're hacks somewhere on the pipeline. And this kind of sort of pipeline poisoning is pretty common as an attack model in military applications, where you need to trust all of your hardware providers. You do not trust cryptography that's too new because you can't inspect it well, and you do not trust any new manufacturer because you've not vetted them. So you have to spend a lot of money having full control over everything that's manufactured from the chip all the way to delivery. Because at any point, somebody could just put a backdoor in, and that would completely defeat the purpose of having cryptography. With quantum protocols, you don't have to do that. There's a thing known as device-independent cryptography that you can do, where the attack model is literally the attacker can manufacture the device and give it to you. The only question you ask is, does the device work according to the specifications? As in, you run a test every time you generate some bits, and you spot check randomly. And if the test passes, with really high probability, nobody could have intercepted your communication. So you don't have to trust the people who give you the device, the people who transport the device, the people who manufacture the device. And this was originally developed because people did not really know how to test that a quantum device works the way it's intended, because you can't look into it while it's working. That disrupts the entire process. That's a purely quantum thing. And so you have this new cryptographic primitive that you can implement that is extremely valuable. And it doesn't require universal quantum computers. So the question is, why is nobody really working on these things? And that's where we realize that there is an intersection of knowledge, of skills between crypto and quantum that's fairly narrow, because application and protocol design is a thing that crypto is really good at, but that people in quantum cryptography are not particularly good at. They make protocols that make them publish papers. They don't really think of protocol design from the perspective that Web3 does. And on the other side, for people in crypto, it's very hard to get into quantum cryptography because that's a very specialized field. And so it's at the very small intersection between these two fields that new cryptographic primitives can be born. And that's a large part of what our business is. I can also add that, for example, there's primitives of direct interest to blockchains and Web3 that we are working on. One of them is one-shot signatures, which would allow you to have instant finality, for example, on proof-of-stake blockchains. You could say a validator can only vote in one way, not because they have an economic incentive to do so, but because the physics forces them to do so. There is no physical way they could cheat on that vote. This is an incredibly powerful primitive that would change the way that, let's say, Ethereum is structured right now. A lot of the complexity of the proof-of-stake mechanism comes from having to incentivize validators to not vote twice, to not do votes on two different branches of the chain, where they get interest from both sides. Like, they will get cut, they will get slashed on one side, so they have to pick. With this, you don't have to implement that crypto-economic incentive, because the vote can only be cast once, basically. That's it. And if you take this and you make it a bit more complicated, you get one-time programs. And one-time programs are small pieces of code that can only be executed once. You're given the mandate to execute this program. You can do it once. You choose some parameters of the program, and that's it. And this way you can make essentially spendable contracts that you can exercise. You have the covering for it. There's the funding is there, but you can only exercise it once. And so you know that you will not double spend, but it's not just money. It's arbitrary financial contracts. And this has plenty of applications. One-shot signatures are a simple example of this, but there are many more. And so we live in this world where we think, what are the applications of quantum technology, not necessarily full tolerant quantum computing, that can be brought to market today? And it's about application design and understanding what the technology can do, rather than having to spend a lot of money to develop a new large computer. So we live in that intersection. That's where our vision.
You guys are creating novel quantum primitives for crypto networks. I wanted to also hit on what folks outside of crypto are doing, because national governments, banks, companies are also having to upgrade. Are all of our Signal messages going to be revealed? All of our WhatsApp messages going to be published? Is our social security database going to be in the hands of other countries? Outside of crypto, what are people doing to prepare?
Okay, those are scary questions. Yes and no. It depends how the encryption worked. I can say for Signal and for WhatsApp, the keys are generated in a symmetric way. I don't believe there is necessarily any public keys that are exposed in the process, so maybe those are not directly vulnerable, but that's not my field of expertise. So the classical cryptographer might be able to say, no, actually somewhere in the step this is exposed that could be attacked. As far as like databases are concerned, almost anything that's being communicated under asymmetric encryption, because it was convenient, if it's being stored, it will be decrypted. That's the sad part of the story. Whatever we sent already, thinking that RSA protected us, that's done. If anybody intercepted the first stage of the handshake where the symmetric key was created, that gives them the symmetric key and therefore allows them to decrypt the rest of the conversation. And there is nothing to be done about that. That's happened. We have to sort of come to terms with the fact that this is already there. If anybody stored these things, that's it. But it's likely that many of these exchanges were not stored in full because people did not really think that this would be a possibility anytime soon. And so maybe for some of the older ones, we are protected. But since we started realizing, let's say since Michele Mosca started talking about this frequently, that quantum can do this and you can just store it now and do the entire process later, I am pretty sure there's quite a few parties that have started archiving all the data that they could possibly archive. And that's it. That's done.
John, is this changing how you're using messengers and exchanges? Are you already acting differently in your day-to-day life based on this knowledge of what's coming with quantum?
Well, it's funny. I've had conversations with the Monero community about what, they're doing about this stuff or thinking about it. I mean, I would say that whether it's mixers or privacy coins, etc., if you've been using this stuff for basically criminal activity, very, very, very bad, to Stefano's point. And then, yeah, in terms of just being aware of the fact that, and these are the attack vectors that are now starting to kind of reveal themselves. Once, Harvest Now, Decrypt Later sort of was out there as far as like a concept, you can be certain that basically harvesting began at a very large scale. That might also explain why certain things are allowed to exist, and so on. And so I think that it's very, very important for people to start to consider these things. And definitely, if you're using blockchains for criminal activity, I would tell you to stop doing that immediately. I mean, stop the criminal activity, but definitely don't use the blockchains.
In our last couple minutes, because we're talking about quantum and because Stefano already referred to believing in parallel worlds, I got to ask you, has your research into quantum made you start believing in parallel worlds or anything else metaphysical? And why is it that some people who study quantum start believing in ideas that were previously in that metaphysical realm? What's up with that?
Okay, yeah, that's an important philosophy physics question. So the entire parallel universe thing gets, of course, it's an idea that existed before in many ways, but it gets some of its physical justification, I guess, from the work of Everett. Everett is a famous quantum physicist. He proposed an explanation of quantum mechanics that was conceptualized in terms of different branches of reality coexisting coherently, and you could think of them as kind of parallel universes. But that metaphor in the original Everett work is a very mathematical model. It's good to have metaphors as long as you know where the bounds of the metaphors are. That's been taken and grown over decades from so-called Everettians, people in philosophy of physics mostly, who believed that this was a perspective to pursue on its own. Now, there is no evidence that this is a better interpretation of quantum mechanics. It's really just a mathematical model. It's useful to conceptualize some things. It doesn't quite work as well to conceptualize other things. There are some very prominent people in early days quantum computing who hold this view. David Deutsch is one of them. And I think it's a bit tricky to go and put out a press release if you're a large organization like Google and saying this leads credence to the existence of parallel universes. It doesn't. It leads credence to the fact that quantum mechanics is real. Yeah, great. I think by now, anybody who says that quantum mechanics doesn't work has been disproved too many times to really count. But it doesn't prove that parallel universes exist. Much as there was another announcement at some point that said that quantum computers had created wormholes in a quantum computer. That's a bit like saying that just because I play a video game, I have created a star into my laptop. Yes, okay, I have simulated a little bit of a star in the sense that I have some colors that kind of look like the sun, and it's a ball, and I can fly a spaceship in a video game. That doesn't mean there's a sun in my laptop. Yeah, there's some degrees of freedom that have been perhaps simulated. A physical simulation would be more accurate, but it's still a tiny amount of a star, which is a very big thing with lots of information in it. And in the same way, having a simulation of a wormhole, quantum or classical, doesn't make a wormhole. It's just a quantum simulation of the thing. And so there's a tendency, and I think it's normal, right? You want to look good, you want to attract people. It's a bit of clickbait, it's a bit of like exciting, a bit of whistling to some communities in physics, but none of it is concrete. It's not science in any sense.
You're going to be disappointed with how we market this podcast. We open up a parallel universe on this podcast, and then we fall through a wormhole.
I think that's fine. I think that's okay. It's more the way it's presented that I think is a bit, it's funny. It's hilarious, but I wouldn't put too much weight to it. It did take a lot of the conversation, I think, and I would have liked more of that conversation to be directed towards Google essentially demonstrated a scalable logical qubit. I mean, that is an impressive achievement in itself. And funnily, the whatever like gazillion number and the parallel universe bit, those were the two snippets of the release that everybody talked about. And nobody just went to the next link, which said, these are the awesome things we've actually technically done, which I thought would be a lot more fascinating. But hey, that's how you market, I guess. Not my job.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you both so very much. Really appreciate your joining us.
Thank you for having us. It was really fun.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Endgame. Please follow me on X, Amanda Cassett, 2 S's, 2 T's. Follow the company I founded, Serotonin HQ, and listen wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the works.